Welcome to Pray for Rain. I am your host, Jack Willis. When I was 25, I was volunteering at this organic farm outside of Austin. And it's through this organization called WOOF, where you volunteer on the farm and then they teach you about that lifestyle. And it's pretty granola in general, very sweet people, but the crowd very much smells of patchouli. Anyway, I'm out on this farm in the middle of summer, so it's like 100 degrees, and I'm sweating my ass off changing out the hay for these goats and watering vegetable beds. And I'm doing this because at the time I was very disillusioned with my job and I just wanted to escape. But on this particular goat farm, they happen to have the biggest and scariest goat I have ever seen in my life. It was the size of a donkey, and it had these 3-foot long spiraling horns coming out of its head. You could have convinced me that it was a stunted water buffalo or something. They called him Zion. And I can remember the woman who owned this farm standing next to me and amping herself up to go in and feed Zion. And she said something to me like, he can get a bit standoffish, so you got to be ready. And I'm thinking, oh, okay. Should have seen him before. I told my husband I'd leave him if we didn't get him castrated. Used to have to go in there with a cattle prod. And then I'm watching this 60-year-old lady enter the pen of this demon goat armed with a trash can lid as a shield to feed Zion. Somehow this brave woman feeds Zion, and then we go inside for some lunch. And I can remember very vividly sitting there while she's telling me about how if everyone rejected society to raise their own goats, all of the world's problems would be solved. And I'm nodding my head along, just eating it up while wolfing down a meal of cold chickpeas. I thought, oh yeah, society is just so toxic. And it's funny for me to look back on that afternoon with Zion and that woman, because I obviously had very romantic notions about how I thought the world should be. Most people, most modern people, don't think of themselves as romantic, certainly not in the philosophical sense. But so much of what we believe today in our politics, our nostalgia, our treatment of young people is purely romantic, with a capital R. We are children of Rousseau, even if we don't acknowledge it. And I'm obviously talking about the philosophical movement here, not about you failing to buy your girlfriend flowers from Trader Joe's. At its core, Romanticism was a response to the Enlightenment, to the idea of the rationality of man. It's the primacy of feeling, of living your truth. It's the soul, it's the inner experience as the seat of truth. It's authenticity over convention, the corrupted city versus the pure, idyllic countryside. It's man's Edenic connection with nature being the purest, most fundamental thing. And when we hear the phrase, or heard the phrase noble savage, that is and was a nod towards the idea that tribal people were pure because they hadn't been infected by modernity. When you watch Avatar, that is a profoundly romantic vision of how humanity could otherwise live. It's but for the shackles of modernity, we would be blissfully happy. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, as Rousseau famously said. And I think we are entering a particularly romantic age, or maybe we've been in it for a long time, for many different reasons, some of them good and some of them not so good. But there's a general feeling of disillusionment in the world, and in the US specifically. There's this idea that we would have a perfect society if not for billionaires or globalists or whomever, which is profoundly romantic. There are corrupting forces preventing us from living in Eden on planet Earth. And when you truly believe in romantic notions, it can take one to very undesirable places. And this comes from both ends of the political spectrum. It's the burn it all down reflex. If you listen to a speech by Zohran Mamdani, were it not for billionaires, America would look like an Ozempic commercial. It's just a perfectly racially diverse utopia of smiling NPCs. And if you listen to J.D. Vance talk, if it wasn't for globalism, life in America would just be a Leave It to Beaver episode. It is the promised return to a pure state of man. And what both visions fail to account for are the trade-offs that we have to make in order to have anything worth doing. And it's not just political either, because this stuff is in the groundwater. The phrase that comes to my mind is lived experience. What exactly are people trying to communicate when they say that? Because you hear the phrase all the time, in my lived experience. And I think it's a bit of a nonsense phrase, because you could just say in my experience, or you could tell a story and people with brains will understand that this is from your perspective, but people don't say that. So what am I communicating when I say in my lived experience? I think it's that my inner reality is actually more authoritative, a truth, than whatever objective thing that you are pointing towards. Not that we can't have subjective opinions based on our own lives, but I think that the phrase itself is romantic trauma vocabulary just used as a trump card. And we see this kind of thing reinforced with modern therapy. Therapy has become primarily an emphasis on validating one's feelings above everything else. And I'll caveat this to say that I think therapy can be very worthwhile and wonderful for people, and I'm not against the practice writ large. But it is everywhere now, and the industry is booming, as they say. And that strikes me as romantic, living based on the primacy of our feelings, that my inner experience is actually the seat of truth. If I feel that I have been wronged, it is therefore something that is true and should be acted on accordingly. What has this corrupt society done to me? What am I owed because of it? I think that therapy should start from the standpoint of a tiger mom. What did you do? And then you go from there. Treat me like a terrible person, and then force me to overcome, and we'll just go from there. But that's not really what we see. The other place that Romanticism is whispering in our ears is how we treat young people. We treat young people like they are somehow these uncorrupted oracles who have yet to be poisoned by society. Have you ever spoken with a young person? Ask them how they would reorder the global economy. Ask them how the economy works. I was a fucking idiot in my youth, but that didn't stop me from having very big ideas on how I thought the world ought to be without understanding how it actually operated, which is actually an affliction that I call autism, and I made an episode about that. But this is why we think that everything that young people choose to rebel against is virtuous, because they somehow are the only ones who sit outside the evils of civilization. They are pure. They're closer to the angelic state of natural man. It's like clockwork now. Young people are expected to rebel at the exact same time. Is that real rebellion? As soon as you set foot on a college campus, your brain chip gets activated and everyone protests the exact same things. That's rock and roll. Not that there aren't things to be protested, or they're always wrong, or there aren't things that we shouldn't want to change about the world, because there are. But we treat people who say this whole thing is evil and we should just tear it down way too seriously, especially young people. Because it's easier to say that than to admit of the trade-offs and compromises that are necessary for a functioning society to exist. It's easier to be romantic. It feels good to say that something is wrong, that you can feel it in your soul, that this is all bad. And it's not that we should never listen to our feelings or desire change, but the truth of the world is that it is messy and complicated, and we have to deal with the desires of millions and billions of people. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made, as Kant wonderfully said. And I can be romantic too. I live the back to the land fantasy. I am on Zillow all the time, just saving 100-acre properties that I cannot come close to affording. These incredibly rural places in the middle of nowhere. And I'll look at these, and on some level, I think that there's an Eden waiting for me in the hills if I can only find it. I can escape society forever to this imagined state of contentment of feeding my chickens in the morning and then just never having to think about a car insurance premium ever again. And I'm basically plugged into every YouTube channel where people are developing raw land or starting a homestead. There are all kinds of cool subgenres like solar punk and myco punk where People imagine alternate societies based on solar power and mushroom technology, which I think is so cool and imaginative. But I try to keep these things in the category of things that I find to be interesting and not necessarily blueprints for a new society we will bring about by violent revolution. And this stuff is all over YouTube and Instagram. We can all escape this corrupt society for a natural paradise. And not that this lifestyle wouldn't be great, and that it's not a wonderful choice that some people make sometimes, because God knows I want it at certain times. But I think it represents a very romantic notion of the world that cannot actually be, not to the degree that we imagine it might. And I think this is why the draw of socialism never really goes away. Karl Marx was a poet before he was a famous political theorist. And what could be more poetically romantic than a total dissolving of class and unfairness, a society of absolute equality where one could fish in the morning and hunt in the evening? The idea that capitalism is wicked and unfair, and I have the solution. The romance of it all is more powerful than the evidence against it, oftentimes. And it is so profoundly human to understand the appeal of this idea. If some guy sits down and starts talking to me and says, hey, listen, you see that rich guy over there? He's actually the cause of all this bad stuff. And I want to take his money and I want to distribute it to the rest of us. I'm thinking, yeah, okay, I'm listening. The rent that you're paying, we're going to pass some laws so that never goes up. Okay, tell me more. Grocery stores, let's make them all free. What else you got? This is wonderful. These are ideas that reject our world today for things that sound unabashedly good, just no downside. Ideas that whisper that things are unfair. You can feel it in your soul. And society should help us transcend. It shouldn't be this messy, complicated, and oftentimes unfair compromise that it is today. Now, Romanticism doesn't explain everything all the time because nothing explains everything. But I often smell its heavy perfume on so many rallying cries you hear today. But there are actually times when I think it does help to be romantic with a capital R, when we benefit from viewing society as more than the interaction between rational beings. And Romanticism was a response to Enlightenment rationality, which had its own problems. There's a tyranny in the idea of pure reason, that everything can just be reduced down to some sort of utility calculation. Even saying that makes my eyes glaze over. It's like I'm listening to Ben Stein. So where can we use some healthy Romanticism today? Frankly, I think some is deserved in the face of artificial intelligence. We should employ it to recognize that there is something unique in our humanness and that our society shouldn't just be surrendered to Sam Altman and co. Or in movies and art. If you've ever seen the Ghibli film Princess Mononoke, that is a profoundly romantic movie. But it's wonderful. It's just a delight. And it's a framework that we can use to view parts of the world and to help us connect with the intangibles of being human and sometimes to inspire change. It's when Romanticism goes unrecognized that it begins to rip society apart or make college students barricade themselves in the library and demand bathroom breaks. And I talk about this all the time on the show. But the idea that under the correct conditions, man can be made to be perfect, that if we just have the right people in power and set up the correct programs, we can transcend. That's how we get gulags. That is how we get biohacking and talks of a different kind of utopia, which is always ironic to me because the word utopia actually means no place. So it's very apt because we cannot get there. But when you combine unacknowledged romantic notions that everything about society is inherently corrupt with the idea that we are purely rational beings, you get the French Revolution, you get the Chaz zone in downtown Seattle. You get the people who think that genders are oppressive, but then want to redistribute wealth at gunpoint. People who say, let's burn it all down, and then we can just figure it out when we get there. Now, I have obviously laid out some very extreme notions of romanticism gone awry, because much of the time it's more of a posture than an actual call to arms. Half of the things that I talk about on the show are about how abundance and technology have created a scarcity of authenticity, that but for the shackles of modernity and screens, we would be more true to our human selves. And I try to make my case where I think that's true, but I'm implicated in this too. I dare say I have a dash of the romantic. But I don't think that naming the ways we are romantic kills anything or prevents us from making positive change. I just think that it stops us from being totally captured by a beatific vision. When we know what's happening, we are then able to do the least romantic and most supremely necessary thing of all, live with trade-offs, to accept that things won't be perfect, to compromise. And then we can do the grinding work of making things slightly better instead of waiting to burn everything down. Because we're not getting Eden. A super goat named Zion may be as close as we get. That's all I have for the show today, so thank you for hanging out with me, and until next time, I am praying for rain.